Most aquarium owners do not really have an algae eater problem. They have a matching problem. They buy a fish labeled as an algae eater, place it in the tank, watch it clean the glass for a few days, and assume the problem has been solved. Then a different kind of algae appears. It grows in dark, wiry tufts along the edges of slow-growing leaves. It grips driftwood. It covers filter pipes. It forms little black brushes that refuse to wipe away. The pleco ignores it. The snails crawl straight over it. The otocinclus keep polishing the soft film on the glass while the black growth continues spreading through the aquascape. So the owner does what most people do. They change the lighting schedule. They reduce fertilizer. They increase fertilizer. They buy a liquid treatment. They scrub the hardscape. They cut away damaged leaves. The tank looks better for a while, and then the same algae returns. This cycle can go on for months, because the aquarium is being treated as if all algae were the same thing. They are not. A cleanup crew that is excellent against green film algae can be almost useless against black-beard algae. A snail that keeps glass spotless may contribute almost nothing against hair algae. A fish sold under a familiar name may not even be the species the owner thinks it is. And that is where one of the most useful fish in the planted aquarium hobby becomes one of the most misunderstood. There is a fish with a long reputation for grazing difficult algae, including the dark red algae hobbyists call black-beard algae. But the real story is not simply that this fish eats algae. The real story is that the aquarium trade has made the name so confusing that two people can walk into two different stores, buy a fish under the same label, and go home with animals that behave very differently. One may spend its youth grazing the exact growth you want removed. The other may barely touch it. Another may become territorial as it matures. And if you do not understand what you are actually buying, the label on the store tank can give you a false sense of confidence. By the end of this video, you will know why black-beard algae is so difficult, what a Siamese algae eater can realistically do, how to avoid the most common lookalikes, why young fish often seem to work harder than older ones, and the single mistake that turns a useful algae grazer into a fish that waits for dinner while the tank keeps growing algae around it. The first thing to understand is that algae in an aquarium is not one enemy. It is an entire category of organisms taking advantage of different opportunities. The soft green film on the front glass is not the same as the green dust that coats a bright surface. Brown diatom growth in a young aquarium is not the same as long filamentous hair algae. Green spot algae behaves differently from staghorn algae. Blackbeard algae is different again. That means the phrase algae eater is almost meaningless unless you immediately ask a second question. Which algae? A nearite snail can be extremely useful and still fail to solve the problem you bought it for. An otocinclus can spend the entire day grazing and never become a serious answer to a mature black-beard algae outbreak. A bristlenose pleco can be valuable in the right tank, but it is not a universal algae removal machine. These animals are not failing. They are simply eating what they are adapted and motivated to eat. The mistake is expecting one generic cleanup animal to control every form of growth in the aquarium. Blackbeard algae is especially frustrating because it does not behave like the soft coating that comes away with one pass of a sponge. It tends to anchor itself firmly to hardscape, equipment, and older plant tissue. It often begins as small, dark tufts in places where flow, light, plant health, organic waste, and carbon availability create favorable conditions. Once established, it can make a beautiful planted tank look neglected, even when the owner is doing regular maintenance. And because it grips surfaces so well, people often respond with increasingly aggressive methods. They trim entire groups of leaves. They remove rocks and scrub them outside the aquarium. They use spot treatments. They change equipment. Some people restart the tank. The problem is that removing the visible algae does not automatically remove the conditions that allowed it to establish. If the aquarium returns to the same imbalance, the algae can return too. This is why a biological grazer should never be described as a magical cure. A fish can reduce pressure. It can graze fresh growth. It can clean areas that are difficult for your hands to reach. It can become one layer in a larger control system, but it cannot make an overfed, unstable, poorly maintained aquarium permanently balanced by itself. That distinction matters because the best algae eaters are often ruined by exaggerated expectations. Someone buys a fish because a video promises that the fish will clean the entire aquarium. The fish removes some algae, but not all of it. The owner decides the fish is useless. In reality, the animal may have been doing exactly what it naturally does. The missing part was the system around it. A planted aquarium stays visually clean when several forms of competition and removal work together. Healthy plants capture resources. Regular maintenance exports waste. Sensible feeding limits excess organic material. Stable lighting gives plants a predictable energy schedule instead of forcing constant adjustment. Flow distributes oxygen and nutrients while preventing dead areas from becoming waste traps. Manual removal knocks back large established colonies. Then grazers consume the thin regrowth and small patches before they become dominant again. That last role is where the right fish can be extremely valuable. Not as a rescue button, as continuous biological pressure. And that brings us to the fish behind one of the most confusing names in the hobby, the Siamese algae eater. Ask 5 aquarists exactly what a true Siamese algae eater is, and you may get several different answers. That is not because everyone is careless. It is because the common name has been used across the trade for closely related fish, old scientific names, updated scientific names, and visually similar species. Even references do not always use the same naming convention. For the average fish keeper, this creates a practical problem. You are not buying a label. You are buying a living animal with a particular body shape, adult size, temperament, feeding behavior, and grazing preference. The name written on a store tank is only the beginning of the identification process. The fish most hobbyists are looking for belongs to the genus Crossochelys. Members of this group are streamlined river fish, built for active movement and constant grazing over submerged surfaces. They come from flowing waters in Southeast Asia, where rocks, wood, and other surfaces develop natural layers of periphyton and biofilm. Their body shape makes sense when you watch them move. They are not slow, armored catfish that settle onto one piece of wood for an hour. They are active, alert fish that cruise through the aquarium, rest on broad leaves and hardscape, then return to grazing. In the right tank, that activity can be a major advantage because they cover a large area. The difficulty begins when stores use the same common name for different fish. One of the best-known lookalikes is the flying fox. Another animal that causes confusion is the Chinese algae eater, which is not a Crossochelys at all. Juveniles can look harmless and useful in a store display, but the adult behavior can be very different from what a planted tank owner expected. A young Chinese algae eater may graze actively, then become more territorial as it grows and shift its feeding behavior. The flying fox is a different fish again, with its own markings and temperament. None of this makes those fish bad. It simply means that buying by a broad common name without looking closely can put the wrong animal into the wrong aquarium. So how do you identify the fish you actually want? Start with the overall pattern, but do not trust one marking alone. The classic Siamese algae eater type has a dark horizontal stripe running from the nose along the body and into the tail region. The body is usually slender and built for active swimming. Depending on the exact Crossochelys species and the individual fish, the edge of the stripe may look slightly uneven rather than perfectly painted. The fins are generally clearer and less dramatically edged than the fins of a flying fox. A flying fox often appears more sharply decorated, with more obvious dark edging on the fins and a cleaner, more formal-looking body pattern. The Chinese algae eater has a different mouth structure because it uses a sucking disc to attach to surfaces, and its overall body pattern changes as it grows. The safest approach is not to memorize one internet sentence and assume every fish will match it perfectly. Compare several features at the same time. Look at the stripe. Look at the fins. Look at the mouth. Look at the body shape. Ask the seller what scientific name they received from the supplier. And understand that even scientific labels in the trade can sometimes be used inconsistently. This is the part most quick aquarium guides leave out. The name Siamese algae eater is often treated as if it points to one perfectly standardized fish everywhere in the world. In practice, the trade history is more complicated. Closely related Crossochelys species have been imported and sold under overlapping names, and some of them differ in how strongly they graze red algae. One name that matters here is Crossochelys langii, often associated with the red algae-eating form that planted tank keepers value for difficult growth, such as blackbeard algae. You may also see Crossochelys oblongus used widely in shops, articles, and hobby discussions. For a fish keeper standing in front of a dealer tank, the practical lesson is simple. Do not assume the common name guarantees identical behavior. Buy from a seller who understands the difference and inspect the actual fish rather than the label alone. Now we need to talk about what this fish can and cannot do, because this is where expectations become unrealistic. A good Crossochelys algae grazer can be one of the most useful fish for applying steady pressure to certain forms of filamentous and red algae. Young individuals are especially famous for working through soft, fresh growth. They may spend long periods picking at rocks, wood, plant leaves, and equipment. In a tank where blackbeard algae is beginning to establish, that grazing can help keep new growth short and controlled. In some aquariums, owners see a dramatic reduction. In others, the fish show less interest, especially when the algae is old, thick, heavily established, or when easier food is constantly available. This variation is important. No responsible aquarist should promise that one fish will erase every blackbeard algae outbreak on a schedule. Imagine two tanks with the same fish. In the first aquarium, the owner manually removes the worst affected leaves, scrubs the thickest patches from accessible hardscape, corrects excessive feeding, stabilizes the light schedule, improves plant growth, and then adds an appropriate algae grazer to control the new growth. In the second aquarium, the owner changes nothing, leaves thick, mature algae everywhere, feeds heavily twice a day, and expects the fish to reverse months of accumulated imbalance. The first tank gives the fish a realistic job. The second tank gives the fish an impossible one. This is why people can report completely different experiences with the same type of algae eater. There is also a size issue that beginners often discover too late. Siamese algae eaters are usually sold small. A juvenile in a store can look perfect for a modest planted aquarium. But this is an active fish that can reach a substantial adult size. It needs swimming room. It can become far more visually dominant than the tiny algae worker you first brought home. A cramped aquarium changes the entire experience. The fish may become restless. It may constantly cross the tank in short bursts. It may disturb calmer species. It may not have enough open length to move naturally. So before buying one, think about the adult fish, not the juvenile in the sales tank. A larger aquarium with good horizontal swimming space is a much better fit than a small nano aquascape. This is one reason the phrase cleanup crew can be dangerous. It makes animals sound like tools. A snail becomes a glass cleaner. A shrimp becomes a detritus remover. A fish becomes an algae machine. But every member of a cleanup crew is still a permanent livestock choice with adult size, social behavior, oxygen requirements, feeding needs, and a lifespan. The correct question is not only, will this fish eat my algae? The correct question is, can I provide a good home for this fish after the algae is gone? For a Siamese algae eater type fish, that means giving it room to move, clean oxygenated water, stable conditions, a secure lid because active fish can jump, and a diet that does not depend entirely on whatever algae happens to grow in the aquarium. This may sound strange after spending so long talking about algae control, but a good algae eater should never be purchased with the assumption that it can survive forever on unwanted growth. Natural grazing material changes over time. Algae populations rise and fall. The fish needs a balanced diet. The trick is learning the difference between feeding the fish properly and turning the aquarium into an unlimited buffet of easy food that removes every reason to graze. This is the management mistake that causes many owners to say their algae eater stopped working. At first, the new fish enters the aquarium and explores everything. It grazes constantly. The owner is impressed. Then the fish learns the feeding schedule. Flakes arrive at the same time every day. Pellets sink into predictable places. Frozen food drifts through the water. The fish becomes efficient at collecting the most calorie-dense food in the tank. Grazing becomes less important because easier energy is available. Weeks later, the owner sees the fish sitting near the feeding area while algae remains on the hardscape, and concludes that the fish has become lazy. But this is normal animal behavior. Why spend hours scraping low-energy food from a rock when concentrated food falls from the sky every evening? The solution is not to starve the fish. The solution is to stop overfeeding the entire aquarium. Feed enough for good body condition and health, but do not flood the tank with more food than the community can use. Watch where the food goes. If large amounts reach the substrate and remain there, you are not feeding the fish. You are feeding the system. Extra food becomes extra waste, and extra waste often supports the very problems your cleanup crew was supposed to reduce. This is where the best tip in this entire video becomes surprisingly simple. Do not judge the effectiveness of an algae eater only by how much algae it removes. Judge the feeding system that surrounds it. A constantly overfed tank can make even an excellent grazer look ineffective. A sensibly fed tank gives natural foraging behavior room to exist. That does not mean rigid fasting schedules for every aquarium. Different communities have different needs. Small fish, juveniles, breeding fish, and specialized feeders may require more frequent food. The principle is broader. Prepared food should meet the needs of the animals without becoming an endless surplus that suppresses natural grazing and increases organic waste. Age can change behavior too. Young algae grazers are often more energetic and more strongly associated with active cleaning. As they mature, many fish become more interested in prepared foods and less useful as dedicated algae workers. This does not mean an older fish should be replaced like a worn-out filter cartridge. It means you should never build the entire stability of your aquarium around one animal performing one task forever. A mature fish is still a fish you are responsible for. The aquarium needs to remain balanced, even if that fish becomes less interested in algae. So, what does a genuinely effective biological algae control system look like? It begins with accepting that different organisms handle different jobs. A nerite snail may be excellent on glass and hard surfaces. A monoshrimp can be valuable general grazers in compatible tanks. Autosynclus can spend much of the day working on soft films and biofilm. A suitable Crossoculus can add pressure against forms of algae that many common grazers ignore. Fast-growing plants compete for resources. Floating plants can remove nutrients quickly if they are appropriate for the setup. Healthy plant mass gives algae less opportunity to dominate. Manual maintenance handles the large patches that no animal should be expected to clean alone. Together, these layers create resilience. But there is another mistake hiding inside the idea of a cleanup crew. Adding more animals also adds more metabolism. Every fish you add eats, breathes, and produces waste. You cannot solve unlimited algae by adding unlimited algae eaters. A heavily stocked aquarium can create the nutrient and maintenance pressure that contributes to more algae problems. This is why a good cleanup crew is not the largest possible group of workers. It is the smallest, sensible group of compatible animals that adds useful grazing without pushing the tank beyond its biological capacity. Before buying any algae eater, identify the algae first. This one habit can save more money than almost any product. Take a clear photograph. Look at the color, texture, and location. Does it wipe away easily? Does it form hard green dots? Does it grow like hair? Does it branch like antlers? Does it form dark, short tufts along leaf edges and wood? The answer changes the strategy. If the growth is blackbeard algae, begin by reducing the established mass. Remove badly damaged leaves that are unlikely to recover. Scrub removable hardscape where practical. Siphon loosened material. Check whether plant growth has slowed. Look for changes in flow, maintenance, lighting, and carbon stability if you use injected carbon dioxide. Then decide whether an appropriate grazer fits your tank size and livestock. This order matters. Too many people buy the fish first and diagnose the problem later. That is how an aquarium ends up with a 6-inch active swimmer in a tank that never had the algae that fish was purchased to eat. Livestock should be the last step in the diagnosis, not the first. If you decide that a Siamese algae eater type fish is appropriate, sourcing becomes important. A specialist aquarium store with staff who can discuss the actual species is usually more useful than a label that simply says, algae eater. Ask what name the supplier used. Ask how large the fish becomes. Ask whether the store has seen the adult form. Compare the fish carefully. Avoid buying a fish simply because someone says it will clean the tank. A knowledgeable seller should be comfortable discussing the difference between Chrysochelys, flying foxes, and Chinese algae eaters. If the answer is only, they are all basically the same, treat that as a warning that you need to do more identification yourself. Then look at the condition of the fish. A useful algae eater is still a fish that must arrive healthy. Look for clear eyes, an intact body, normal swimming, and a healthy body profile. Avoid animals that are severely thin or struggling to maintain position. Watch them for a few minutes, if possible. Healthy, active fish should respond to movement around the tank and interact naturally with the environment. Quarantine is ideal when you have the ability to do it, especially when adding fish to an established, planted display that would be difficult to medicate. Once the fish is home, do not expect instant transformation. A new fish is adapting to new water, new tank mates, new food, and a new environment. Give it time. Observe where it spends the day. Watch whether it grazes hardscape and plant surfaces. Check that faster tank mates are not taking all prepared food. Make sure it is not being harassed. And remember that a fish can graze algae without visibly erasing a mature outbreak overnight. The most valuable effect may be that the algae stops advancing as quickly, while your maintenance and plant growth begin turning the system back in your favor. There is also an important difference between controlling algae and creating a sterile aquarium. A healthy aquarium is not a polished glass box with no microbial life. Biofilm, microorganisms, small patches of algae, and natural surface growth are part of an aquatic ecosystem. The goal is not zero algae. The goal is preventing one type of growth from overwhelming the visual design or damaging plant health. Once you accept that, algae control becomes less stressful. You stop reacting to every green spot as an emergency. You begin watching trends. Is the algae expanding or shrinking? Are the plants producing healthy new leaves? Is the glass staying cleaner for longer? Are the same problem areas returning? These questions tell you more than a single, perfect photograph. This is why the most successful planted tanks often look effortless from the outside, but are built on many small forms of consistency. The owner does not wait for a disaster before acting. They notice when plant growth slows. They trim before old leaves become algae farms. They feed with restraint. They clean mechanical filtration when flow drops. They remove dying plant material. They keep the light schedule stable. They use livestock as partners in the ecosystem rather than emergency equipment. Over time, the tank becomes easier to maintain, not because algae has been defeated forever, but because algae is no longer allowed to gain a large advantage. And this is the real value of the Siamese algae eater story. It is not about discovering a secret fish that makes aquarium maintenance unnecessary. It is about learning to think more precisely. The word algae eater is too broad. The label in the store may be too broad. The common name may hide several different fish. The same species may behave differently depending on age, feeding, and environment. A fish that is excellent in one aquarium may be inappropriate in another. Once you understand that, you stop buying solutions based on marketing categories and start building a system based on biology. So when blackbeard algae appears, do not immediately reach for the strongest chemical on the shelf. First, identify what you are looking at. Remove the worst established growth. Find the reason the algae gained an advantage. Improve the health and consistency of the tank. Then, if your aquarium is large enough and the livestock is compatible, consider a properly identified Crossochelys algae grazer as one part of the solution. Buy the fish for the adult fish it will become. Feed the aquarium responsibly. Do not expect one animal to carry the entire system. And do not assume that every fish sold as a Siamese algae eater will behave exactly the same. The surprising part is that the most powerful change may happen before you buy anything. It happens when you stop asking, "What is the best algae eater?" and start asking, "What exactly is growing in my tank? Why is it winning? And which combination of plants, maintenance, and compatible grazers can keep it under control?" That question changes everything. Because once you match the solution to the actual problem, your cleanup crew finally starts acting like a system instead of a random collection of animals. And if there is one thing to remember before you leave, remember this: the fish is not the secret. The match is the secret. The right animal, in the right tank, eating the right kind of growth, under a feeding routine that still allows natural grazing. That is why one aquarist can call the Siamese algae eater the best algae fish they have ever owned, while another says theirs never touched the problem. They may not have purchased the same fish, they may not have had the same algae, and they almost certainly did not have the same system around it. So before your next algae treatment, take one step back. Look at the growth closely. Look at the animals already in the tank. Look at how much food enters the aquarium. Look at how your plants are growing. Then decide whether you are trying to remove a symptom or rebuild the balance that keeps the symptom from returning. That is the difference between constantly fighting an aquarium and finally learning how to work with one. If this changed the way you think about algae eaters, subscribe for more practical freshwater aquarium guides built around biology instead of quick fixes. And tell me in the comments, what is the one type of algae that has given you the most trouble?